Portland State Oral History Project focuses on Oregon's land use planning program. It provides the opportunity for key participants to recount stories and anecdotes regarding how this unique program was developed, implemented, and evolved over its more than 4 decades in existence. It is July 31st, 2017. My name is Michael Rupp. I'm a former member of the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and before that a staff member with the Douglas County Planning Department. Also here is my former colleague at the Department of Land Conservation and Development, Jim Knight. Jim and I will be interviewing Lloyd Chapman, another colleague at the Department of Land Conservation and Development and staff member responsible for administration of Forest Lands Goal, Statewide Planning Goal 4. Welcome, Lloyd, and thanks for agreeing to be interviewed.
It's good to be here.
Okay, could you give us a brief personal background about you and your family settlement and life here in Oregon?
I was born here and grew up in Eugene, and one side of the family came on in covered wagons in the 1840s, and the other side on ships from Scotland in early 1900s.
Wow.
So a varied background in that way. And I went away for a while, but came back to Oregon because it drew me.
Okay, so did you graduate high school here?
I did. I graduated from North Eugene and then Oregon State, bachelor's degree. Spent a couple years in the Peace Corps in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And then decided it was time to go back to school, and Syracuse gave me money to go to school, so I thought I'll do that.
Sure.
And got a master's in public administration, and I was on the East Coast, and I realized I'd been around the world, but I hadn't been to the East Coast really. And so I stayed in Albany, New York for a year working as a Senate intern, and then went to New York City working in the mayor's office for 2.5 years in New York.
So which mayor was that?
John Lindsay.
Oh, wow.
And then Abe Beam came in and brought in, I forget what they called them, the Democratic clubs. They had people who'd been waiting a long time to get a job, and they wanted to refill positions, and I had all I could take of New York, which was a great place, but
Yeah.
Oregon kid, and so I moved back to Oregon. And
wears on you after a while.
it does, yeah.
Okay, so how did you end up in Oregon's land use?
Well, I came back in '75 and was recovering at a that my dad had built in Cascadia, east of Sweet Home. He was a state highway engineer building Highway 20 over the pass in the 30s, and I was living in the cabin and said, okay, it's time to find a job. And '75 wasn't a very good time to find a job, nor was '76. And I finally came in for an interview with Hal Bronner. Decided how to wear my suit, and Hal looked at me and I think almost said, this guy's been from New York, he's wearing a suit, he doesn't belong with us. And got hired as a citizen involvement specialist pending the outcome of the 1976 ballot measure. So I went to the election night party. No one knew who the hell I was. Been an interview panel of 2 or 3, but nobody else.
So you didn't know Jim?
I don't know who was on my interview panel. I don't recall now. But anyway, I showed up at the party and was like, who's that guy? And we won the election, and so they had jobs, and I got a job.
Yeah.
The people who were there. So,
Yeah.
so I started in '76.
And working in citizen involvement. Is that?
I was hired as a citizen involvement specialist to take care of the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee, which needed a little reining in, I think was the thought at the time.
Who was chair of the committee?
Might have been Artis.
Artis, he was.
There's also Judy Sweet was from LeGrand. Yeah, from Yachats or Depot Bay, Garrett Smith. Lot of, Merrill Mosier was around, and
So when you say reining in, what was the climate of,
well, they had been instructed early on to get a citizen involvement goal written and adopted before the process really started.
Okay.
So that citizen involvement would be active, and then they were very active in pushing for citizen involvement during goal adoption, and in pushing
And you came just after the goals were adopted, is that
a
right?
year after.
Yeah, okay.
And they were still, then they were reviewing citizen involvement programs, and the goal said that you had to have a committee for citizen involvement. And the perspective was that would be independent of the city councils and planning commissions.
Commissions, yeah.
And,
Okay, I remember.
and it was becoming clear that lots of small communities, that wasn't happening, and it was becoming more planning commissions designated or city councils designated. And I think the committee was upset with that. Some members, those aren't real citizens if they're planning commissioners or city councilors, so.
Yeah.
Did you travel much in the beginning?
Yeah,
Did you?
because CIAC met all over the state. We met in Lakeview and LeGrand and Eugene and the Dalles, and so we'd meet monthly, so.
And were you the only staff for the CIC?
Yeah,
then?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And and our agendas were primarily to approve citizen involvement programs, local citizen involvement programs. And I developed a compendium of citizen involvement approaches that communities could use in newsletters, and the structure, whether you have area committees or
Right.
more specialized committees, and trying to provide help to local governments about how they could get citizens more involved. So that was my, I did that until, for just less than 2 years. And then the plan review team was formed in '78, and I was assigned citizen involvement goal, forest lands, and energy conservation goal. And then I was in that position till '82, and decided that I'd had enough of coping with forest lands at the state level.
Right.
And left, continued to work a little bit with the agency, and then was asked to come back and be the agency's representative on a water planning task force in the John Day Basin in '85 and '86. And then in '86, took a full-time job and became the agency's IT person until 2003.
Varied career.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay, let's see. Senate Bill 100 created a framework for land use planning across the state. Based on the legislation, let's see, do you believe the Land Use Conservation Development Commission correctly addressed the objectives of SB 100 through the creation of the 19 statewide planning goals?
I think they largely did. I think that later on there's a question about what things led to Senate Bill's creation. And to me, it was just sort of people were concerned about how development was occurring and how they saw the future in California, I think, to a certain degree, and it troubled them. And I think the goals kind of broadly addressed the issues that were of concern to the folks at that time. I think there are probably a couple of places, I think we'll talk about it later, but Goal 5 didn't really work in the way that I think it was hoped it would work in terms of protecting natural resources, resource sites, really smaller sites particularly. I was the one who was responsible for the energy conservation goal, and the goals were written in 1974, the gas crisis.
And the energy crisis,
and all
yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
And working with the forest lands goal, which did not have precise guidance. It was very general, and this energy conservation goal was equally. I mean, I used to recite the goal, and I used to recite it 26 words backwards.
Yeah.
But that's all I knew.
Yeah.
It was like anything, if I had no basis to require anything. And so we didn't implement that in a way. I didn't push it, and no one else did.
Well, there's no advocacy for it.
No.
I mean, even though it was,
Yeah,
we were all lining up at the gas pumps.
yeah. And so that was a missed opportunity, I think, that we could have done a bit more.
Yeah.
To have, I mean, I think it was certainly a thoughtful goal, but its language in some ways, just as in some other goals, it wasn't.
So when you
good.
started out, goal 3 and 4 were driving at least the rural side of the program.
3, 4, and 14.
And then housing and
Yeah.
housing and 14 were driving the urban side of the program.
Right.
And so some of the goals in between probably got.
Yeah, and, you know, I don't know that the recreation goal has had an impact anywhere.
Yeah.
Economy and public facilities, I don't know if that goal has affected it. It probably did affect some, you know.
We had periods where it rose and then
Yeah.
went back.
Yeah, and whether there was a crisis that it could be used to
Yeah.
help push somebody to get some needed infrastructure in.
Yeah.
It was done, but otherwise, not as much.
Okay. Of course, this one will probably lead into our discussion on goal 4 at a minimum, but of the 19 statewide planning goals, which goals do you believe have been the most important to accomplishing the objectives of the state's land use program, and which ones do you feel the least? So I guess we kind of started to cover that a little bit.
Started that. Certainly the 3, ag and forest and urbanization, I think, are the heart of the program, the guts of it.
Yeah.
It's interesting, I've been doing a lot of research on the forest lands goal, and actually not, some of it a bit related to my time, but also a lot of it in terms of the statute and the goal adoption. And in the goal adoption process, staff, probably Mr. Knight included, in August of 1974, was a staff recommendation that the commission, they were struggling so much with adopting the goals. They just were, it was scattered, trying to figure out what path to take. And staff recommended they adopt just 3 goals. Those 3, ag and forest and urbanization. And that you know, you could handle natural resources in the ag and forest, or in the forest area. You could handle transportation and housing in the urbanization area. I mean, the goals might not have looked like they do, like the adopted goals,
Right.
but that was a perspective that got dropped at the wayside as we went on to the initial.
At least it was
14.
considered at some point, though.
Yeah, but it was
Yeah.
considered there early in that process.
Yeah.
So I think those are the key ones. I think transportation has become a pretty effective vehicle of, sorry for that,
No.
for pushing transportation forward as and in local planning efforts. But as I served as on the Salem-Keizer Transit Board for 10 years, and it will be next year, and there will finally be a real funding source to provide reliable local 6 or 7 day a week service in the state's capital. So it's taken a long time to get there.
But the goal helped contribute to that.
But I think that
Yeah.
the goals has continued to push us to look at all modes, to think about public transit, to think beyond our cars.
Yeah.
And I think that, and pedestrians and cyclists also. The major one that I think has been, its ineffectiveness has been most apparent lately is housing, just because of affordable housing and how sparse that is. Helping a family here in town of 9 try and find a 3-bedroom apartment that they can afford is hugely difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't have any solutions. I don't know that we could have projected. I mean, I think the land use program has really added to Oregon's popularity and attracted population to it that its land use program has not been able to fully serve. So
Yeah.
that's I mean, I think, and there was, the St. Helens policy back in the late 70s. I mean, there's been a push on housing for a long time, but
Yeah.
it has not really, I think.
Can't keep ahead of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Can't.
disparity is.
Right, and there are a lot of complaints about urban growth boundaries as being the cause of
Yeah.
the price of housing and rental costs. It's an element, but there are lots of other things contributing to that too. So,
Let me go back into you mentioned goal 4, and I guess I'm gonna spend a little time having you talk about the,
let me catch that.
Okay. Should we wait till then, or?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, let's,
okay.
I'm not gonna
I know,
let
you
you.
let me off the hook on that point. Let's see. Well, we kind of talked about question 5 already a little bit, with which ones do you think have been the most successful? Are there any land use policies, subjects, or topics that are missing from comprehensive plans that LCDC through statewide planning goals should have required governments to address?
Well, as I did the research about how the statute was built, my perception is, and I wasn't around at the time, I was living in New York, so I
So
wasn't.
You were in New York too, I think, Jim, so.
But the statute had areas of critical concern, which were environmental resources, at least as I saw them.
Right.
It had activities of statewide significance.
Right.
Which were public facilities or other kinds of things. And then there was local planning. And those two areas of critical concern, were never implemented. I think only recently was an activity, a statewide, or something,
Yeah.
one thing was approved. But in my mind, the one piece that really would have made a difference was have freeway interchanges designated as activities of statewide significance.
Yeah.
It strikes me that having some piece of state review of those interchanges, because there's such a huge state investment.
Right.
And yet, cities communities can allow development there that can really undermine the capacity of the roads.
Very much so.
And so, in my mind, that's really the one area that we never really stepped into.
Yeah.
The program never really
Good point. Yeah.
moved into that area. And
Yeah, I can think of a few also.
There might be some others too, yeah.
Let's see. Question 6, 1974, LCDC and TLCD undertook an unprecedented public outreach and involvement effort in adopting the first 14 goals. And you probably weren't here then, even though you were here before then and after that date. And I was here then. I was down in Douglas County. Was it worth doing, and how, and views?
I absolutely think it was worth doing. I think it built a basis for support that carried it through some really difficult times. And more specifically, as I did my research, Goal 4 wasn't in Senate Bill 10. Forest land wasn't in Senate Bill 10. Forest land wasn't in the goal, the other site of things to be considered in Senate Bill 100.
Yeah.
Was not listed in Senate Bill 100. It was not listed, so when the first hearings went out, it wasn't listed. And people said,
It has to be.
it has to be there.
Yeah.
And my suspicion is that the forest industry was just as happy to not have it listed.
Right.
And it was only that citizen involvement process, I think, that just not only said, oh, you have to list a goal, but a recognition, Goal 3 is ag and Goal 4 is forestry. And it took a long time. It took till December until they actually moved it to number 4.
Yeah.
But they recognized, no, this is an equal resource that needs to be planned for in as serious a way as ag land.
Yeah.
So I think that process in terms of Goal 4 was important, and then the scope of reaching out to people all across the state was really important in building some support for the program and
Were
getting.
there other goals that emanated from just the citizen outreach process that you? I know there were issues with respect to when they had the goal hearings, that different factions decided that their goal couldn't, or their issue couldn't be addressed under a single goal, and it broke up into multiple goals. But I didn't know whether, that's first I'd heard of the forest goal actually emanating from the public outreach, which is really, I mean,
Yeah.
that's great. I mean,
The other one that I've been looking into was the shorelands goal.
Yeah.
Because it was not a coastal shorelands goal. It was a shorelands within
All of,
the coastal, actually it was within it went up to the crest of the cascade, of the Coast Range.
yeah,
That Commissioner Shell had been really pushing for, was some kind of recognition
so
of that importance.
lakefront could be involved in shorelands as well.
And it's interesting, we were just mentioning with Rob about the loss of federal money
Yeah,
because of the inadequate protections in the Forest Practices Act now. In the last 2 years,
Yeah.
the federal government has determined that the Forest Practices Act isn't adequate to protect water quality in coastal streams. And that was the issue in 1973 and 1974 that
yeah.
Steve Shell was trying to get implemented.
Paul Rudy probably as well.
Paul Rudy as well, yeah, I was mixing those
Yeah,
two guys up.
Yeah, both of them, on the first LC, yeah, on the first commission. Let's see. Okay, so obviously question 7 talks about citizen involvement and how critical it is to the development of the program. Is this goal still relevant today, Goal 1?
I think it is much less relevant in terms of impacting things. There's, Goal 1 was written as a time shortly after a few years after the maximum feasible participation, I think was the federal catchword, some such phrase like that, that was a part of federal housing and things that you had to involve citizens. And what I think has happened in Oregon is that the process has become, understandably over many years, much more defined, limited, refined, and there's not as much place for citizens to be creative, I'd say. as there was writing the goals, developing a comp plan when the goals were not really clear, that kind of a role. And then there is so much litigation. Planning has
Right.
been, much of it has moved into the court's framework. And a lot of that is good and it's been valuable and has helped push it along, but it also made citizens feel like they had less of a voice.
Right.
That there was more.
Yeah, a lot of sideboards on
Yeah,
everything,
yeah,
and your
yeah.
channels all the energy
Yeah,
into
yeah,
one spot. and
yeah.
not- A little less creativity, I guess, at least.
Yeah, I think that's
Or the
right.
opportunity to challenge something, I guess, has become
Mhm.
not only more litigation, but expensive, and so it makes it,
Right. Yeah, it's
People-
not the same kind of open-ended kind of process. It occurs less frequently than I think did earlier.
yeah.
And so, yeah.
Let's see. So, do you believe the statewide planning goals struck the balance between state and local control that LCDC intended in 1974?
That, I think that, I mentioned earlier that the program really had three policy parts to it. The activities of statewide significance, the areas of critical concern, and the planning goals. And according to Hector, it wasn't until late in 72 that they actually talked about the planning process, and we ought to have some goals for them. They didn't call them goals, they called them something else initially, but that it was really pretty late in that interim, that work group, Hector's groups, discussions, that the idea actually came up. And I think that through the process, I mean, the land use planning, there was always some level of, well, not always, but for a while there'd been some level of planning
Yeah.
and
Well, even
level
Senate
of
Bill
detail.
10 established the concept that everybody
Yeah.
had to have a plan.
Yeah, that-
So,
Uh-huh.
when I was in Douglas County, we were operating under, they were afraid to adopt a comprehensive plan, so they called it the Interim Comprehensive Plan. And it was it was interesting because it was a booklet, very short, or very small, and had little splotches of where they thought
Stuff would be.
development ought to go, but didn't want to make it too firm. That's why it ended
That's
up
right,
being
yeah,
interim.
yeah.
And that relationship between the zoning and planning wasn't connected.
Wasn't made yet, yeah.
And of course, it wasn't until Fasano and some of the major court decisions in
Yeah.
Oregon came out that
Yeah.
kind of changed and added the structure to the system.
And I guess, to me, this has always been about, land use planning has been, well, who is in charge here? And to what extent is it local, and to what extent is it state?
Yeah.
And I think it has gotten, it became much more state-focused than people expected.
Yes.
That the balance was pushed pretty heavily towards the state.
Is that because of the legal framework that kind of came along
I
with
think,
the
I think,
process?
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think I mean, there was a lot of talk about that as they were talking about Senate Bill 100 and
Yeah.
stuff, and worry about that. But in the end, there was a lot of talk about what the commission was gonna do. But because, I think the two key decisions, the Baker decision, I think, was the one that said zoning has to follow plans,
Yes.
has to be consistent with the plans.
Yes.
And Fasano, which said you had to have findings.
Yes.
Then
Well,
there
they-
was just a big, okay, now there's a whole,
Yeah, they separated the
Little bit-
legislative and quasi-judicial.
Yep.
That changed the whole way we approach it.
Yeah, and it became a much more legal framework for
Yeah.
much of planning.
Yeah,
And
and really
that
set up.
pushed the balance to the state, because decisions were made by state courts, decisions were made by the commission, statewide body. That's,
Right,
you know, you didn't challenge the decision at a local court
Totally local.
For some planner zone change. It went to LCDC, it was state
Yeah.
courts, it was LUBA that did those things.
Yeah.
And really pushed it to the state in a way that I don't think the framers had expected it to do.
Yeah.
And I guess when I think of it, and talk a little bit, you take this opportunity to talk about forest lands more specifically, because my view was that it has become that the industry, the forest industry, was the major industry in Oregon up until through this into the 70s, certainly.
Oh, yeah, 70s was,
Yeah, they were still quite strong. And they were quite strong in two aspects. One, they controlled the Board of Forestry, and the Board of Forestry in 1971 approved the Forest Practice Act. And that act was written with things that grated on me as a person who was doing land use planning stuff, because we said we didn't accept May policies. That wasn't a policy.
right,
That was an opinion, a good idea.
right,
But that wasn't you weren't saying what you were gonna do. Well, the Forest Practice Act had, whenever possible, if necessary, almost every rule that was written into the regulations
right.
had some sort
Wasn't
of
really-
comment.
Wasn't really a rule.
Yeah, it didn't-
gave discretion to the
Yeah,
operator. to
great
make
discretion,
decisions.
which is the timber industry, that was their preference.
Right.
And the Board of Forestry was dominated by the timber industry.
Right,
In the planning area, they were very comfortable dealing with county commissions. They were the big employer in town. When they asked for something, they almost always got it.
right,
So they were very comfortable with the balance of power right as it
Well,
sat.
Sure,
They didn't, and to the extent, I mean, they didn't mind state control when it was the Board of Forestry that was the state controlling body.
right,
And they didn't mind on land use if it was the local planning commission. The goal, and they were, there is a line in the goal that got inserted at the request of the Associated Oregon Industries and the Oregon Forest Industry Council, that was a specific phrase: existing forest land uses shall be protected unless proposed changes are in conformance with the comprehensive plan. To me, as I read that, when I took on the forest goal, I said, well, all you have to do is change their plan to say, we think golf courses are an always appropriate use in forest land,
yeah,
and
the door's open.
the door's open, they zone it, and never got challenged on that, but that was a specific thing, again, in my mind, trying to allow the local government more authority over forest land. And that was never raised by a county for whatever reason, and I never have understood why I didn't get challenged on that as a reviewer of the local plans. But It was,
And Thousand Friends didn't pick up on that at the,
I mean, they would have challenged it, I think, and maybe they challenged, maybe somebody raised it locally and Thousand Friends came after them. But it never came to me as somebody saying, well, we have amended our comprehensive plan to, but then that amendment, I probably would have argued, okay, how does that protect forest land for forest uses?
yeah.
Or conserve forest land for forest uses? And such.
This has always interested me too, but, so it's a little bit off the subject, but, or maybe it's not. The white papers that came out, you were probably.
Common questions.
Yes, common questions. Were you the author of the Goal
Yes.
Forward one? Okay. Of course, I was local, and I was trying to figure out, okay, how are we gonna meet the statewide planning goals? And then the set of common questions came out, and I think it was 3, 4, and 5 at least. I'm not sure if there were maybe housing, I don't know. I'm trying to think
I'm not
of-
sure.
Okay, but I know 4 came out.
Yeah,
because I
4
was
came out.
working on 3 and 4
But
locally.
I think even then, we could not get any clear consensus from the commission on the uses allowed,
Okay,
even in that common questions. And about the time the commission was set to adopt it, I forget who, somebody said, no, you have to adopt these things by rule. And
Right.
so it got pulled
Right.
back.
Yeah, they
And-
were challenged, and it
and
went to
then
the Court
we-
of Appeals,
Yeah.
and they said, yeah, you had to have rulemaking for the
And
white
that-
paper.
maybe
Common questions.
for the
could
common,
be-
and that may have been for the common questions on ag, that
Yeah.
actually came court case and then said, no, you have to adopt these policies by rule. And so,
That set things in motion.
so then we went back and tried to do it by
Rulemaking.
rulemaking, and we couldn't get 4 commissioners to agree on what uses were allowed in forest lands.
Yeah.
Can you describe the staff at Forestry a little bit, in terms of the people you work with? Were some of them thinking along your lines, as opposed, or were they all of one mind? Dave Steer was there, right, we had, and people like that?
Yeah, Dave was there.
Dave was there. I mean, I started with, Bill Holtzclaw just ripped the forest lands goal. And most other goals in the letter that went to the commission in
And he was a
December.
state forester.
He was assistant state forester at the
Okay.
time.
And
So
what were his issues, other than he didn't want anybody treading on?
he thought, you guys need to inventory, you're going way too far, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be inventorying and know what our resource is, then we'll figure out what to do.
Okay, so is that how the goal got, that's how the goal got written initially, wasn't it? More of an inventory goal than a prescriptive?
Well, again, there was no initial, wasn't an initial goal.
Yeah,
And then it got written, and they tried to put in an inventory, there was an inventory requirement in the goal.
right.
With a manual, which was totally inappropriate to use for inventorying forest
I
land.
struggled with that, yes.
So that Bill Holtzclaw was the first one. Mike Byerly, forest land issues have, on the one side, they really wanted to be have timber companies, it was about timber harvest, and they thought local people would protect timber harvest better than anybody else. And the second piece of that was, they didn't want anybody else regulating forest operations. And gradually, the land use program was protecting the forest land base. And the people kept seeing that. The Buter report came out in 1976 that said,
Right.
we're gonna be way down by 2000 and in timber harvest, and we better protect what we have. And they were beginning to take that more and more seriously. And then here's these counties out there talking about maybe a little scenic corridor along a stream, or a significant environmental overlay over this piece of the forest that would influence and limit forest operations. And Forest State Forestry was adamant that that was their territory, not the area of planning. So Mike Byerly, I guess what I would say is I just saw a very, very steady drift of the department from a really pretty strongly anti-land use planning. The first forest report for Oregon, or I forget exactly what the title of it was pretty quiet or ambivalent at best on land use planning, and then gradually it got stronger and stronger with Kevin Birch and Dave Steer and then Ted, and they really, I think, over the course of 15 years or so.
Jim Brown, they were.
Huh?
And Jim Brown, was really, when he became director, it was just the opposite. He was very much for
Well,
what
but
we were doing.
I worked with Jim
Yeah, at the beginning,
intensely on a assessment of Goal 5.
Yeah.
And he, he wanted land use to be about protecting timberland for timber,
Right.
not for
Other resources.
other resource values.
Yeah.
In mid-'80s when I was
Yeah.
working with him on that
That's
project.
at the beginning, but then towards the
Yeah,
end,
then he'd been enough involved in land use planning to know that this has a value, a real
Yeah.
value to the industry and
Yeah.
to the.
Well, and they saw it even beyond that, I think, in that, I know when we were working on the new strategies for protecting forest lands and letting housing, some type of housing go, Ted and Kevin, we were, they're the ones that set up the formula for allowing housing now. And
uh-huh.
it was based on the idea that if they could incrementally keep some of the resource land protected, it wouldn't further encroach into forest land.
Right.
And we had the same thing with Bob Saunders from BLM.
Mhm.
They were they were the ones that were enlightening us to the fact that if you allow a few houses, their whole idea of cutting and, managing forest lands has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
And even firefighting, the
Yeah.
whole strategies for firefighting were so different if you have houses there
Yeah.
versus no houses.
Yeah,
And so,
when you can let the fire burn to the ridge.
Yeah.
Or not.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway, there's, I think all of us kind of learned as we do,
Yeah, and we had a lot to learn in terms of,
Yeah.
of those
Forestry
kinds of
issues as well.
things and the appropriate way for land use to provide support and, fire standards and access standards and those kind of things.
Yeah, I remember my first meeting, you were just leaving, and of course I took your spot as.
Right, 1982.
Go for, and I was sitting back there thinking, what did I get myself into? That hearing we had, I think Robert was objecting and Ann was tormented by the fact that they couldn't get an agreement on what the uses were in the 025, remember the 025 section?
025 section of it.
And we
yeah.
went, I don't know how many more years before we finally got an 025 section, but it was a long time.
I'll take this, to just talk about the acknowledgement process, because that, my perspective, the first plan, Gillum County came in and had no forest land. Crook County came in and they had zoned forest land essentially as EFU, and probably had a 40-acre minimum. And we had signed off on it. I don't know if Ann had voted against it or not. But
This is Ann Squire. by the
Ann
way.
Squire, yeah. And then the deluge began to develop of plans being submitted, and that process was just incredibly difficult because if you read the goal, I think if you read the goal, you say you must conserve forest land for forest uses. And
Right.
forest uses are pretty clearly defined, and it doesn't include housing. And it doesn't include a lot of things that people like to doing the forest.
Right.
And so one would say, okay, you can't do any of that. Very similar language in the Ag Lands Bill, in Goal 3, and you have an EFU statute that allows all kinds of things out in that land. So you have two poles out there, and every time, and so we never got to that, any middle ground about, in a policy way, saying, okay, this is what is allowed. So then was left up to the individual acknowledgement reviews. And no two county plans, no two county zoning ordinances, more importantly, are the same.
Right.
They all have a little different framework, and every time something different came in, Thousand Friends would challenge it. That's fine, except that then it would be tried to be applied to somebody who had already been reviewed. And they said, well, what about you made this decision?
Right.
And then the commission was in the position of either saying that, yeah, you have to meet the, I don't care what we told you before, you have to meet this new requirement, or saying, no, that we gave you your list, it's okay, and so the goalposts have changed between those different reviews.
Right.
You know, so they were stuck, staff was stuck, counties were stuck.
Well, of course, counties would watch the commission, and then they'd borrow anytime the commission made a decision.
Right.
If that plan was less stringent.
Right.
It would get exported all over the place, and
Right.
we'd be, and then you'd have to look at every decision, every jurisdiction to see if their forest land was similar to the plan they were even using as their example.
Right.
Which in cases it's not.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, it got to be very hard
yeah.
to thread the needle, so to speak.
That, for me, that was just I felt like I was just in the middle of a grinder.
Yeah.
For years. It was trying to I understood, and the counties were in the grinder too, I understood that.
Sure.
But you had and Goal 5 wasn't really we weren't getting effective programs for Goal 5, which often were more aimed at applied more to forest lands and
Correct, yeah.
more specifically to forest
Yeah, the
operations.
habitats that needed protecting
Yeah.
happen to be in the forest lands,
Yeah.
probably more than
Yeah.
not.
So it was a difficult period. I don't know that I could have done it any better than I did. I wasn't a forester, and that was a problem, but I don't think that mattered.
No, it didn't matter. I wasn't either, and it didn't
Right.
get any easier for
Right.
for us.
But anyway, there was a job opened up at LCDC, and I thought, well, I ought to apply to that. And the more I started thinking about applying for a job, I said, no, I think I need to quit. And so I did.
Well,
Back at a time when I could.
Immediately after you left, we had some court decisions that just, it made it even more difficult.
Right.
Benton County came down, and I remember sitting at a meeting with Craig and I, and we were in front of Lane County, and Peter DeFazio was asking us questions because he was at the time county commissioner, and I had no clue. I mean, he was asking questions about, now wait a minute, Benton County court decision said this, and unfortunately the Benton County decision, as the courts every once in a while does, they just totally missed where we were headed.
Right.
And they picked up on a word that wasn't one that we were focused on, and they ran with it and changed the whole scope of things. And we had to try to make sense out of, now how can, Lane County submitted this, and why isn't that good enough based on Benton County?
Right.
And I remember Craig was trying to explain it, and, we were going around in circles, and we weren't getting anywhere, and DeFazio kept saying, that doesn't make sense, and that was the best we could do. It was awful. And it wasn't until we finally got to rulemaking, many years after,
Yeah,
that finally stabilized for a while.
Right.
We still had the housing question, and they wanted to go on necessary and accessory as the standard.
Right.
And that worked just great for a number of years until I think there was a case out of Coos County where Luba bought off on a woodlot owner having a home on his property because he cut firewood. And that blew everything up again, and we had to go back into rulemaking.
Yep.
And,
That's my limit.
yep, so you went through the same,
Yep.
yeah, it never got easier.
No.
Do the coastal goals, coastal program have any effect on what we did? Because I would think that Goal 17 and shorelands, have any,
The only, when I was, I don't think those goals had any effect.
really?
I mean, when I was working with Jim Brown on assessing the Forest Practices Act and Goal 5 resources, which I did in '83, I think.
Right.
I never, coastal resources and the research on coastal streams and salmon and stuff was pretty relevant to
Right.
the point I was trying to make about the impact of forest operations on resources,
Right.
Goal 5 resources. But the coastal program, no.
Did you have any allies on our staff that would help?
Oh, I
Or were
never.
you all by our own?
Well, it was, I mean, I think you were an ally. I think Craig was an ally. I think Claire was an ally when she was here. I think Ron was an ally. But in the end, people had, in the end, it's the commission makes the decision, and
Right.
I mean, I finally got pretty good at writing reports that took it as far as I could take it. And I think I didn't have, I always struggled with your red pen, Jim, but.
We all did.
You would always hope it would run dry.
That's right, that's right. But it's not that I felt any.
Hostility. Or-
Any really disagreement among the staff. They knew what place, I mean, I was in because I had the goal, but it wasn't my fault that I was there or anything, so
Right.
that was never a problem in my mind.
Other than to conserve forest lands for forest uses, the goal didn't really help you in confining or, identifying what it is we wanted.
Right.
And it made it difficult because some of the other goals were more prescriptive. They said,
Right.
do this and this is how
Right.
you meet the
Right.
goal. Goal 4 was,
I mean, and we pretty quickly decided if it's forested, that meant it was forest land.
yeah,
If there were trees on it, and that was fine, and we got it designated, and you knew when to take an exception. That was fine. It was just, what do you do with it? How do you meet that? And the goal used conserve and protect, and didn't use preserve. It used one other word, but the fact that it used multiple words, and then. I guess quickly that didn't matter. It was, here's the list of uses.
right.
And here are there some limitations that can be put on when and how those uses are allowed that would make it okay? And we pretty quickly decided, if you're gonna put in a golf course on forest land, you probably need to take an exception. If you're gonna put in a reservoir, you probably need to take an exception. I mean, there was things that there were easy steps, places you could go, but there was still a
But the
lot
goal
of gray.
didn't recognize the realities of what happened in forest land at the time. You have aggregate operations going on.
Mhm.
In aggregate, they need it for the roads to build forest roads, and it
Yep.
didn't say anything about those, but
Nope.
yet everybody knew, that happens in forest land. So
That's
how
right.
do you deal with that?
Yeah,
And of course, you get into a fight if somebody doesn't like that particular aggregate pit.
right.
They'll say it violates Goal 4.
That's right.
And yet the other folks that need to use it, so it wasn't helpful in some aspects.
That's right, yeah, it just was, it was.
It's silent on things.
And,
that-
I don't, those goals, I mean, there was, in August of '74, LB said, let's not adopt goals. And he presented the commission with a letter with 5 points. Let's adopt the citizen involvement goal. Let's adopt the goals that were in Senate Bill 10 because they had a legislative authorization. Let's commit to looking at including coastal goals in some amount of time, and let's commit to doing the goals in another year. And the commission approved all 5 of those things in August. And in October, they said, let's get goals done. And in December, they were adopted. So.
Did Steve go along with that idea of the commission? Because he was there at that time.
Yeah.
I would think he would be resisting that. This is history, I really.
Well, yeah, I know, but I think it was unanimous. I may be
Is that
wrong.
right?
I may be wrong, but I think it was that they and Dorothy and
Jim Smart was there.
Paul Rudy, I think they were
Rudy
all-
was there. But I think, LB was feeling the pressure. There was some talk of another ballot measure, and he was trying to slow things down and calm the turmoil a little bit. And so the commission, but at that same meeting, Steve said that there should be committees to help the staff write the goals. And he was given, and LB told him, if you want committees, okay, but you have to appoint them. And he took advantage of that, and he did, and so you got more
These
people.
are the tax back.
Yeah, the technical advisory committees, and that more technical people involved in a number of different goals that helped. At some point, it said that the ag and forest goals were the same, but it was the forest technical advisory committee was very much a forest group that worked on the goals.
Yeah. You can listen to Ward Armstrong's interview of that.
Yeah.
When you look back now, you wonder how the heck did we ever get through those years?
Well, that first year, getting the goal adopted and then surviving those early ballot measures, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
That and just the interest groups. Did the federal agencies help us out at all, or not, looking back? Forest Service?
Well, Saunders was always good at BLM. Forest Service was always too distant. I never knew them to.
Now, I worked with them when I was in Douglas County.
Right.
They were helpful locally.
Forest
And
Service?
occasionally they would submit some comments on an acknowledgement, but not very often with a national
Yeah,
forest.
Saunders was the one that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, BLM did.
Yeah.
Pretty active on that.
How are we doing here, time-wise?
Well, we'll keep going here, probably,
We'll get done.
yeah. How do you think Oregon's land use program in 2017 compares with what was envisioned 4 decades ago? I'm down at 10.
You're down at 10, okay. Well, I think the local flexibility is significantly reduced than what was expected back then. And I really think there was an expectation that there would be activities of statewide significance. There would be areas of critical concern that really never, Columbia Gorge became its own
Right.
national,
Yeah.
federal thing. But I think both of those, I think people thought that was going to be a equal parts, parts of the program that aren't there now.
Yeah. Are there any changes or additions you'd like to see to our planning laws and the statewide goals to enable Oregon's land use program to face challenges of the future?
I've mentioned both, I think I'm not sure how we could do, can do a better job on affordable housing. I think that's, in my mind, the biggest issue facing the program. And I think transportation is also a big issue. Portland is distinctly more difficult to drive in now than it was. I mean, it's, I don't know what it was like before the recession, but the recession dropped vehicle miles traveled significantly.
Yeah.
And then there's just been a pretty rapid rise, I think, in them. And I think that's largely a funding issue, and and Oregon is not a generous state in terms of state services and state taxing rates, I don't think. So to me, that's the places that the challenges lie.
It's not something that planning laws necessarily affect
Yeah.
as much as other things.
Yeah.
Some of Oregon land use observers believe that the approval of Senate Bill 100 was possible because of the time period in which we live, the 1970s and the birth of the environmental movement. The enactment occurred because of the convergence of four key factors: a vision, leadership, federal money, and luck. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree, or do you believe there were other factors that were critical to the passage of Senate Bill 100?
I guess the question says the time period in which we lived, the 70s and the birth of the environmental movement.
And actually
And
it
that-
goes along, I'll ask you the next one too, because do you think it's possible Senate Bill 100 would be approved today in the Oregon legislature?
Yeah.
So they're all kind of.
Right. And to me, there was a recognition in Oregon about sprawl. And Tom McCall was worried about Charbonneau. There was Willamette Valley Futures, I think it was called. It was a plan for the valley, which was very interesting because it was it had two alternatives, housing all the way, or you protect farm and forest land. Although there was never anything in it about forest land. 2/3 of the watershed is forest land.
Right.
No mention of forest land in the plan. But Charbonneau, I've read, was really key to him saying, we have to do something. And so I think that public awareness, which was not particularly an environmental awareness, it was just like people go to California and say, it was real clear to see that could easily happen in the valley. And so I think that was a piece that was, I think, important in terms of creating the times that made the time right, helped make the time right. I think Oregon could approve a land use planning now. I think that the urban-rural divide is more recognized now. I mean, certainly it was recognized in '73 and '74, but Trump times have Malheur Wildlife Refuge occupation events have made it a more polarized place. I think there was more middle ground in the '70s than there is now.
Yeah.
And that would make the opposition more forceful than it might have been then. But I think Oregon would probably could pass it now.
And I guess they have, in the sense of the reactions to various ballot
Yeah.
measures they seem to do.
Yeah.
They do like the program still. I
Right.
guess. Is the state land use program equipped to address and properly respond to major changes in Oregon? Examples are population growth, economy, climate change, environment, affordable housing, which of course you mentioned. over the next 30 or 40 years, or do you think changes are needed?
You don't mention an earthquake and tsunami on the list there.
No, and that's a good point. I should add that. I'm concerned about it.
I think land use is as well prepared as any other agency. Again, I go back to the fact that we are not, I believe we're a pretty low tax state, and therefore don't have the resources to do some things that might make us better prepared for those kinds of things. But the land use program is I think, a relatively effective part of that response. And some of that stuff, I don't think the land use program can necessarily, I mean, we could say you need to deal with a new 100-year floodplain everywhere you go and map it and say, put in new rules. But I think we're as well prepared as any other agency.
At least we have the vehicle to do that.
Yeah.
The system exists to do that.
Yeah.
So, let's see. What is your view about the future of Oregon's land use program? Do you believe Oregonians have accepted the state land use program and will continue wanting cities and counties to plan for growth and protect resources through comprehensive planning and zoning laws like they have for the last 40 years?
I think it's a part of Oregon at this point. I think it's part of why people move here, and it will continue to be a pretty unique part of Oregon. It will be it will be interesting. Eclipse comes and there'll be a jillion people wandering around who come from probably mostly from the West, though, but they will see it different than people from Vancouver, Washington. If they drive out in the country, it looks very different than if you drive out in the country from Portland, in terms of the level of development and rural residential development things. And so I think that they will see it and they will recognize that Oregon made a different choice, and I think it's been a good one, and I think it will continue to be a.
I worry about local government really being on board in terms of just their staffs, planning commissions. Are we really doing enough in terms of outreach to reach out to them and to get them to understand what needs to be done, and evaluation of the program in terms of how are we doing? I mean, I think the word evaluation is a tough one for people to swallow. It's, on one hand, it could be nothing at all, or else two, it could be very, very serious in terms of how are we doing in terms of dwellings in rural lands, for example. I mean, I don't know. You look at Bend, for example. Shoot, what's 80,000 people there now? I think a fantastic number. And when we started, it was what? You guys are Oregonians in some ways, and it was what, 10 or 15 or something
Probably,
like that?
yeah.
Yeah.
15
Not
to
that
20.
we should choke off growth, but you just wonder, are we out of our mind in terms of running? We can't control it in a direct way, but we need to find ways to direct things better, I think.
For me, I mean, you can't, and I don't want to limit people if they want to move here.
Right.
We have to create an environment that allows what is essentially Oregon to survive as many people as want to be here. And when we start failing to do that, they will start not wanting to come here. And maybe and having more people here makes it harder. But that's the challenge, and if we can do it, then finding ways to share that message with other places, I think is. And in terms of evaluations, there need to be evaluations. The problem is, I mean, I think the periodic review stuff, it got too overwhelming. And instead of saying, well, I'm very much an incrementalist, you go look at your plan and say, this is our weakest spot. Let's hike that one up. Let's strengthen that one. And then 3 years later, okay, now this is my weakest spot. Let's do that one. Instead of trying to do everything, which is, I think, sort of what periodic review envisioned. It was an all-encompassing thing.
It's a longer discussion than we have time for today, but is that acknowledgement to periodic review?
I'm hoping not.
You know,
Well, but that's how it was viewed.
Yeah, exactly,
And
exactly.
that was the that was the bad part.
So how do we step back from the edge, so to speak, and ask ourselves, we've made this tremendous investment politically and financially and a lot of things, and now here we are.
In my judgment, it has been has significant success.
Yeah, but how do we gauge that, say, for the next 20 years? And or are we just gonna trust people to make good decisions, and whatever good means, but and do we have enough in the way of our toolbox to help people do a good job out there when we have a lot of these growth issues coming along?
I mean, yeah, I'm not close to what happened in Damascus, but that's a troubling thing. And I don't even know if Damascus was formed in order to avoid urbanization, which communities
I think it
do.
was. Yeah, I think it was initially.
And then they disbanded, but we need to be able to concentrate development, I think. And create new cities that, in fact,
Create new cities.
that will welcome people and welcome density, so that it isn't spread out over a broader region and impact the resources that are there.
We have a wonderful thing to market with people coming to Oregon.
Mhm.
It's a beautiful place, and all the qualities we are very, very, very proud of and happy, but we can't have it all. We have to figure out a way to strike a balance.
Yeah.
Maybe we've done that as best we can do, or do we want to step back and ask what more is needed? And as the questions asked, we have a lot of challenges coming up here in Oregon.
Yeah.
Not that we're unique in that respect, but.
I mean, I made that observation about Vancouver, Washington, and there's
Yeah.
a study was done a couple of years ago of structures in the Portland metro area, including
Structures.
Vancouver. And the change between a couple of years. I think there's a map in here, which I'm not finding. But it's just the degree to which, and it's almost, you can't really see it here, but you can see there's just massive development. Every dot out
Yeah.
here is rural development. And if you look in here, you
Is that
can't.
from the forest land study?
Yeah, well, it's from a Seattle based research group. But it
Yeah.
was just like totally different. So we need to help people continue to think about these issues and figure out how to deal with them. And I have opinions, and lots of other people have opinions. And we need to, I think, probably being aware that do we have tools that will help us in this process? I mean, if you have quality public transit, could make a huge difference in terms of whether people how they choose to live,
Mhm.
And whether they want to be out in the rural areas, or if they want to be urban and can do without a car.
Well, here in town, so to speak, we've just had a big decision, I think, coming from Luba about amending our boundary, Irving Brook boundary on the west side to allow a third bridge. And I guess they're gonna rule that that hasn't been justified or something. We had an agreement or something with Polk County and maybe, I don't know exactly, but of course, you talked about court right, they'll give you all the answers you want. But,
Right.
not that that's bad, I'm just saying that, are we saying no to prevent good quality planning, or is there more that we should be doing? That's a rhetorical question. I don't know what the answer is there. And we have a lot of new people coming to Oregon who don't have the background or the sense of history and time and so forth of what we have accomplished here. They come from other states and, well, we want to come to Oregon because you have a great place to live. Yes, we do, but you
And
can't
how
have
many,
it always.
and how many of the people in West Salem would be really happy to get a better commercial center, an office center that would limit the need for travel across the bridge?
Well, and you come down Wallace Road like I do, on the way home from courthouse, and the traffic lined up on Wallace Road coming across the bridges is incredible. It's pole to the, border to border, or bumper to bumper, I'll get it right. But and the same thing is coming down, look at Portland, it's just incredible.
Yeah.
And that can't be a quality of life that we're trying to aspire to, is it? I don't think it is or should be. So how do we, what are our leaders going to do to address some of these issues? And that's the question that Mike's raising too, is that are we as good as we can make it, or is there other challenges up ahead? We're going to have to really get on our horse here if we want to.
And I think it's gonna be on transportation and housing.
I think that's
That we're gonna have to, and we're gonna have to figure out how to blend them so that, well, it's jobs and housing and transportation, so that people can, can make their trip, their daily commute is a half hour or less. That means having affordable housing close to where they work and a transportation mechanism that allows them to do that. And
cars, that's what, frankly, that's one of the things that's out there, is it really is a pain, is it? We love cars in this country, our state and so forth is no different, and yet we can't have it always. I don't think we can. And you're suggesting we need to find some alternatives in terms of transportation for these for commuting. And if we don't.
And having the housing close to those major employment centers that people who, that for whom having a reasonable commute is important, and they can.
Now, how do these questions get raised? That's the other thing, process-wise. Is that something that our legislature should try to deal with? I'm not sure. Individual communities, cities and counties. Some, yes, others, no.
No, I think communities can.
I think they are raising
They
them.
can do it.
Yeah.
I think they are raising them.
Yeah.
Well, they're raising them. The question is, the answers that are out there are not easily gotten to.
No, they
And,
don't.
the money for all the things we would like to see is not there.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
well,
I think you feel better about our program because at least there's a structure there to try to solve these problems.
Some pieces to put,
Compared to
yeah.
other places
we,
where there's no
we
structure
are
at all.
standing back and saying, we put our best years of our lives, for the most part, work-wise, into making this program darn good. And for the most part, we were successful. Now, we sit here, we could have a whole bunch of other people in the same room. And are we succeeding in the future, or have we laid the seeds for success? I don't have answers to these
No,
questions,
no.
but.
I'd like to think you've laid the seeds for
Yeah,
success.
I mean,
at
We've
least-
tried.
yeah.
We've laid seeds. Will they grow?
Yeah.
Well,
Or have they already grown? And,
Yeah,
You
We're on
on
tracks
goal 4
that,
and Ron on goal 3, and some people who have just spent the better part of their lives in process-wise and a whole bunch of things. And, I don't mean to be negative, but, you know, it's hard to step back and look to the future. That's what you're asking with these questions.
Sure.
And are we gonna make the turn, or whatever the way you wanna say it, or are we there? And maybe the future is gonna be a great thing. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. We don't know if
If we're gonna, yeah.
if the framework is strong enough to really
The tools are
keep
there,
going,
right.
you know, with the change that's happening with all the economic issues and job changes and Amazon and drones and.
Right, yeah.
I don't have a sense of how we're doing relating to the planning program in terms of the local planners. You know, what do we call what's the group called? The
Planning directors?
planning, well, not just the directors, but, you know, the urban, what is it?
Oh,
You know what I'm talking about.
yeah, the Oregon Planning, the Statewide Planning Association.
Yeah, yeah.
Or the national
Yeah.
APA, American Planning
Not that-
Association.
Not that they have any magic answers, but have we gotten, do we meet with these people anymore?
I'm sure they do, yeah, I don't think much of that saying, we have field reps that know, you know, all the planners in their jurisdictions and.
Right.
And there still is a state
Yeah,
association
there's a
that
real
meets
connection
and
there.
stuff,
Right, okay.
and they are probably hearing from other folks with other
Yeah, I'm sure.
perspectives.
I'm sure they're having similar discussions on housing and transportation all the time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
And economic development, that's a whole other topic, but.
Yeah.
I guess we're out of time today to talk about John.
I'm gonna ask one more question.
Okay.
And then we'll let you go.
We didn't even talk about SAC at all, did we?
Well, kinda, but not.
A little bit,
No.
but.
We had used the
that's a
term
whole-
SAC.
that's a whole
That's
other
right.
discussion.
We talked about it. If you were again involved in such an undertaking, had the chance to influence the development of new comprehensive land use planning program, what lessons learned from Oregon's approach would you borrow, and what aspects of the land use program might you avoid?
Setting UGBs was huge.
Tremendous success.
That, you know, that Wes had done it here, huge UGB, but he drew one before there was LCDC.
So are you saying you used to start out with UGB?
Setting UGB, saying, okay, we're not gonna grow out beyond this for a long
But
time.
now they just passed a law in the legislature to, what did they, you know, there's like something for communities.
I think it
over
was
10,000.
that wasn't this session, but the last session.
Last session,
And they did some experimental thing with.
Mhm.
And I'm just nervous about that because you say yes. a
But I
lot
think
here.
it has something to do with housing affordability.
It does.
Right.
So,
And if they can prove that housing, that
UGBs are.
lack of
causing-
land is the primary cause of the lack of affordability, then we need to consider that.
Something needs to be done, yeah.
That's one issue. Clear protection of resource lands, I think, is important. Added emphasis on multimodal transportation, affordable housing,
I worry about water.
are those things. Jim, you're way too worried.
That's what I was paid to do for 29 years, right? Was to worry, right? I need to be more optimistic.
I'm guessing you would have more emphasis on statewide significant areas you talked about earlier.
Yeah, I probably would have.
Areas of critical concern, is that something in the
Well,
program?
those are harder, but this, statewide significance, I think.
We missed an opportunity.
The freeway interchanges, I'm sorry.
No, I-
Keizer Station sucks.
Yeah,
Its location, its design,
Yeah.
sucks. And it should not have been there.
I can tell
On
you.
on the other hand, in 5 years, when downtown Salem loses Macy's and Penny's and Nordstrom and the malls, what's downtown Salem gonna have?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that either, that's a
Yeah.
problem. Those are the things that I think. I think better defining the state and local roles, which I think would give communities an incentive to be more, and citizens an incentive to be more actively involved in their plan. Somehow finding a way that, it seems to me that the pendulum has, from the beginning, swung to the state through the goals and then through the acknowledgement and then through the legal, all the legal processes and all the rules. And so I think had we been able to design a process that somehow allowed for more variability, and maybe we would have lost things, ag land, forest land stuff. But if people could have made a case to do something different, because this is why we're different and this is why this is going to work here, that creativity, I think that we've lost some of that. So I would work to trying to pull that balance back a little bit. There's a risk, but that I think would have helped us find solutions maybe that we haven't found because we are over on this side with a pretty rigid definition of all aspects of planning. So that's the piece. I'll just take it back briefly to the, we didn't talk very much about the Forest Practices Act and the really excruciating battles that were waged over county regulation of forest operations and the legislative maneuvers, and that was also that same local control versus state control. In that case, it was Board of Forestry control of those rules, and not wanting the locals to take a role. And had we found a way for the locals to have control to protect some sites that maybe were worthy and find a way to protect them in cooperation with the landowners, that would have been a valuable place to have gotten to. So.
Okay.
I just feel like we're just beginning. And I don't mean be all totally negative, but I just think this dialogue through these interviews and these discussions have been wonderful. You know, and there's so many other people that ought to be brought into that. You know, but
Let's let him end in that.
Then we can talk about it more.
Okay.
On behalf of Portland State University and those of us involved in the Oral History Project, I would like to thank you for your time. I really appreciated hearing about your role and your thoughts about Oregon's land use planning program.
Oh, and that, we didn't talk about IT, which, that's okay. The other thing I wanted to say about, because I've watched many of these, is that, and this is about policy. This policy happened because there were a lot of commissioners and staff, and the staff included a lot of support staff who did a huge amount of work to get this shit all done. And they worked incredibly hard, and I realized that we're not getting their stories, and they were an important part of what made this happen. So thank you, Jim.
We had a kernel of people at the beginning that somehow we got it together, and we survived somehow.
Yeah.
And brought others in, and you're right about support staff too.
Yeah.
That was back before computers and all that stuff, and